Poor rancher was forced to marry a woman twice his age, but she gave him more than he ever dreamed. Texas Hill Country. Spring of 1883. The old chapel stood at the edge of the prairie like a weary sentinel, its wooden steeple leaning slightly, its white paint long since peeled away. Inside, the air smelled of dust and candle wax. The pews were crowded with townspeople who had come not to bless a marriage, but to witness a transaction. Elias Brooks stood at the altar, his shoulders squared, his fists clenched inside threadbare gloves. 22 years old, he wore a borrowed suit that hung too loose at the waist and too tight at the wrists. His boots bore the mud of his family's failing farm. The sound of whispers from the pews pressed at his back like a swarm of gnats. Beside him stood Catherine Monroe. She wore white. Not the pale cream of lace or the soft hue of silk, but a stark, almost blinding white, unadorned and severe. It clung to her tall frame like winter light. For more than a decade she had clothed herself only in black, mourning her child, hiding from her husband's betrayal, and shutting the world out. Today she stood in white, as if daring every eye in the chapel to look and judge. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pinned high. Her face was calm, unreadable. She did not smile. She did not wear a ring. Her hands hung at her sides, gloved, still. She did not look at Elias, nor at the people filling the pews. Her gaze rested instead on the dusty organ at the back of the chapel, the one her son had played before he died. The preacher cleared his throat. His voice trembled as he read the vows. There were no flowers, no music, no exchange of rings. No one said, "I do." Papers were signed on the altar like deeds for land. With each stroke of the pen, Elias felt a part of himself slip further away. The townspeople murmured behind their hands, "She bought him like she buys cattle. Look at that dress, white after all these years? She's mocking us. Poor boy, doesn't even know he's being led like stock." Elias heard every word. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. In his chest a voice whispered, "I am not a man. I am a trade." A horse led into the chapel. He stole one glance at his mother seated near the back. Her hands were clasped tight around her kerchief, her face lined with worry and shame. This was her doing. Her plea to Catherine had saved their land but cost him his freedom. When the preacher finished, Catherine turned from the altar without a word. The townspeople shifted in their seats, disappointed that no spectacle had followed their gossip. Outside, the sky was pale and flat, and the wind pushed dust across the chapel steps. Catherine's skirts brushed the wooden floor as she walked to the waiting carriage. She did not look back. Elias followed her, the eyes of the town burning into his back. The carriage wheels creaked as they rolled away from the chapel. The prairie stretched endless and dry, dotted with mesquite and thorn. Neither of them spoke. Elias stared at the horizon, his mind a tangle of anger and disbelief. Across from him, Catherine sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, the white of her dress stark against the dark interior of the carriage. At Monroe Estate, the butler opened the door. The house loomed ahead, stone walls, tall windows, silent halls. No celebration awaited them, no feast, only the echo of their footsteps. Catherine paused in the foyer. Her voice was cool, even, and precise when she spoke. "Your room is at the end of the east wing. I do not expect anything of you." Elias inclined his head once. She climbed the stairs without another word. He stood beneath the heavy chandeliers, staring up at her retreating figure, at the flash of white disappearing around the landing. He did not feel like a husband. He felt like a contract. And yet, in the defiant whiteness of her dress, after years of black and mourning, something silent and challenging glimmered. Not warmth, not kindness, but a dare. Elias drew a breath and followed. Not because he must, but because something in that white dress told him this story was not yet finished. Monroe Estate, 5 days after the wedding. The Monroe Estate was a house meant to echo, its ceilings high, its halls long, its doors thick enough to keep voices from carrying. Elias had never known such quiet, could feel so heavy. Every footstep he made seemed to bounce back at him like a question no one dared to answer. His room sat at the far end of the east wing, just as Catherine had told him. It was large, too large, with a fireplace that had not been lit in years, and books on the shelf that had never been opened. The bed was too soft. The windows were too clean. The silence pressed on him like a second skin. They never shared a meal. Catherine rose early and spent her mornings in the greenhouse or at her writing desk. Sometimes she rode into town with her foreman and returned with ledgers and books. She never knocked on his door, never asked where he went during the day. Elias spent most afternoons helping the stable hands or walking the perimeter fence just to feel the wind again. They passed each other in the hallways, like ghosts in different lifetimes. She was not cruel, not cold even, but she was all distant. Her words were brief, polite. There was no warmth, yet also no disdain. One afternoon, Elias returned early from the stables. His boots were still dusty, shirt damp with sweat. He noticed the study door ajar and peeked in, thinking to ask about supper, though he knew there would be none shared. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. Glass bottles lined the shelves behind Catherine's desk, tinctures, oils, and perfumes, some labeled in Latin. He reached to straighten one that had tilted awkwardly. It slipped. The bottle hit the desk with a soft thud and rolled, landing on the floor with a crack that seemed louder than it should have been. A sharp floral scent filled the room. Elias froze, heart hammering. Catherine appeared in the doorway. She looked first at the broken bottle, then at him. Her eyes held no anger, no surprise. Just stillness. "I am sorry," Elias said quickly. "I should not have touched anything." Catherine stepped into the room, her heels soft against the rug. "There are some things," she said quietly, "that do not need to be touched, to be broken." Elias looked at her, really looked. For the first time, he saw it, not coldness, but caution, not distance, but fear. Her hands, always so composed, trembled just slightly as she picked up the shards. She did not scold him, did not send a servant to clean the mess. She knelt and did it herself. "I can help," Elias offered. She paused. "Leave it," she said, not unkindly. "It is only glass." But the way she held the pieces, tender, careful, almost reverent, told him it was not just glass, it was something more, something tied to a time before him. Later that night, Elias sat on the edge of his bed and stared out the window. He had thought her distant because she did not care, but now he began to suspect the opposite. Catherine Monroe had built her walls high, not to keep people out of hatred, but out of necessity. She had been broken once, maybe more than once, and now she lived like the bottle he had shattered, beautiful, fragile, and untouched, for fear of falling apart again. Elias lay back, the scent of lavender still clinging faintly to his fingers. He did not know why it mattered, but it did. She was not made of ice. She was made of smoke and glass and sorrow. And now, he could not stop thinking about her. Edge of summer, late afternoon. The sun bled low over the ridge. The stable smelled of old hay and regret. Elias stood alone, sleeves rolled, hands calloused and raw from a week's work. Nails between his lips, he hammered the last slat into place on the newly repaired stall gate. The wood was smooth now, new, strong, safe. Behind him, the other workers had long since gone home. He stepped back, surveying his work. A year ago, a boy had died here, Catherine's son. He had not known at first, no one had told him. But the whispers in town had filled in the blanks. Poor boy never had a chance. She bought him a thoroughbred, but forgot to teach him how to fall. She lost him the way she lived, with money in hand and no one holding the reins. He had not believed them, not after what he had seen, the care in her eyes when she watered the orchids, the way she whispered to the horses when she thought no one heard. But today, the stable hand, Tomas, had set it straight. She has not stepped inside this place since it happened. He was 13, tried to jump the fence. The horse panicked, snapped his neck on the far post. Elias had stared at the splintered beam for a long time after that. Then he picked up a hammer. He did not tell her. He did not ask permission. He just began. Every night after work, he returned, pulling down the old gate, replacing hinges, sanding every surface, until the barn smelled more like cedar than sorrow. It was not for praise. It was not even for forgiveness. It was just something that felt necessary, something unspoken between them that needed tending. On the seventh evening, as he swept the last of the dust into a corner, he heard the faint crunch of gravel behind him. Catherine stood just outside the stable door. She wore black. She always wore black. But today, her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Her hands were empty. She did not speak. Her eyes moved slowly across the space, past the new wood, the polished saddles, the quiet stillness. They landed on the far post, the one that had ended everything. She closed her eyes, just for a breath. When she opened them again, they were shining. Elias watched her. He did not move. "I did not mean to intrude," she said at last. "You are not," Elias replied. "It is your home." She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes were not stern, not proud, just tired. Tired in the way people get when they have been carrying something for too long. "I used to stand right there," she said softly, nodding toward the tack bench. "Every morning. He would mount up, flash that ridiculous grin, and shout something foolish just to make me worry." Elias smiled, faint and reverent. Catherine's voice caught slightly. She cleared her throat. "They said I did not love him, that I tried to buy his happiness." "They were wrong," Elias said. She nodded, but her eyes did not meet his. He did not try to touch her, did not step closer. He just stood there, quiet and open. And for the first time since he had come to this house, Catherine did not walk away quickly. She stood in that doorway, between light and shadow, and let the tears gather without shame. Then she turned and left, boots soft on the path. Elias leaned against the stall door, breath shallow. The barn no longer smelled of old grief. It smelled of beginnings. The evening had slipped in quietly, with the sky painted in strokes of rust and violet. Inside the house, a gentle calm settled, lamps glowing low, the scent of chamomile drifting faintly through the halls. Elias and Catherine sat across from each other in the library, a worn book open between them. She had just read a line aloud, her voice smooth and distant, and something in the cadence made Elias look at her differently. She was not fragile, not like glass, but like flint, worn and fire-hardened. And in that moment, something stirred in him. Not duty, not pity, but desire, real and quiet. When she handed him the book, their fingers brushed. Elias reached for her hand, not fast, not forceful, just a touch, light and unspoken. But Catherine recoiled. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just a sharp inhale and a step back, her eyes wide, as if she had been burned. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elias stood still, the sting sharper than he expected. Then his voice, low, clipped, broke the silence. "I'm not a child, Catherine," he said, "and I'm not here to soothe your guilt or fill some hollow room in this house." Her gaze dropped, but he didn't stop. "I'm not something you bought to replace the son you lost. I am not here to be fixed. I can stand, I can choose, and I can damn well love." He turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out. The wind outside was cold, but not colder than what he carried in his chest. He rode into town in silence, the horse's hooves cutting through loose gravel. By the time he reached the saloon, the lamps were flickering behind dirty windows and music drifted faintly from inside. He stepped in, not for drink, but for distance. He sat at the edge of the room, back against the wall, watching the others laugh, shout, sway. He did not speak, did not move. And then, softly, a shadow fell beside him. A hand rested gently on his shoulder, a familiar scent, lavender, faint but unmistakable. "Catherine." She said nothing, only placed her shawl, his favorite, the one with the stitched corners and worn softness, over his shoulders, then turned and left, silent as she came. He looked down at the fabric. The scent was warm, gentle, something he had once told her he liked. Once, in passing. And yet she remembered. She had been listening. That night, Elias did not sleep. He returned home after midnight, walked the halls alone, and stood in the doorway of the library long after the fire had burned low. Meanwhile, Catherine sat in her own room, alone by the mirror, her hands folded tight in her lap. The housekeeper entered quietly, bringing tea she knew would go untouched, but Catherine spoke before the woman could leave. "Do you know what my husband once said to me?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "He said I was elegant and dignified and too cold to ever be loved properly." The housekeeper froze. "He found warmth elsewhere," Catherine continued, "in someone younger, louder, softer. I was the storm. She was the calm." She looked up, eyes sharp despite the shimmer behind them. "And I let him make me believe it." She reached for the lavender shawl on her chair, clutched it. "I lost my son. I lost my pride. I lost the right to be touched without suspicion. And now this boy, this man I've married, he looks at me like I'm a field after winter. Like something that might bloom again." The room was still. "I don't know how to trust it," she admitted, "but I remember every word he says, every silence he gives. And that terrifies me more than any betrayal ever did." She stood slowly, walking to the window. Outside, the moonlight blanketed the estate in silver, and somewhere below, Elias moved through the darkness, eyes lifted to the house that had become something more than shelter. That night, neither of them reached for the other. But something had changed. Not broken, shifted. And come morning, the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a space where something true might grow. The wind that night howled across the prairie like a warning, shrill and constant, shaking the trees and rattling the windows of the Monroe estate. Rain had begun to fall, light at first, then heavier, turning the dry earth to mud and streaking the glass panes in endless trails of gray. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and deliberate, like footsteps approaching. Inside, the world was still. The lamps were low. The fireplace gave off more shadow than light, embers buried beneath ash. And in the master bedroom, Catherine Monroe lay pale and unmoving, her skin flushed with fever, her lips parted in shallow, labored breaths. Elias sat beside her, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight with quiet panic. He dipped a cloth into the basin and pressed it gently to her forehead, brushing damp hair from her face with a tenderness he never had to explain. "You need to fight, Catherine," he whispered, voice barely above the storm. "You don't get to vanish again, not this time." The room smelled of sweat and lavender oil. The sheets were soaked. Her nightgown clung to her skin. Still, she did not wake. Elias stood and moved through the house with quiet purpose. He lit the stove and boiled water, his hands trembling only once. From the pantry, he pulled barley, onions, and a small bundle of herbs he had seen her dry weeks ago. He cooked as best he could, no salt, no precision, only hope. The broth simmered softly, steam curling upward like incense. The smell filled the kitchen, and for a moment he closed his eyes, wishing she were there to tell him what he'd done wrong. When it was ready, he poured it into a bowl and carried it upstairs, even though she could not drink. He sat beside her again and opened a book, an old volume of poetry she once left near his breakfast tray. He read aloud, slowly, each word falling like a stone into the silence. He did not know if she could hear. But he kept reading. When the gray light of morning crept through the windows, he saddled the horse and rode into town. The streets were slick with rain, the sky heavy with cloud. A few shopkeepers were setting out barrels, untying signs, sweeping puddles from wooden porches. He dismounted at the apothecary and stepped inside, boots squelching on the floor. "She has a fever," he said, placing coins on the counter with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Give me what works. The best you have." The shopkeeper blinked. "Mrs. Monroe?" Elias's voice was calm but low and firm. "No, my wife." A silence fell. A woman browsing nearby stopped mid-reach. A stable hand froze near the door. The weight of Elias's words settled like dust in the room. "She deserves to live," Elias said, "not just survive, to live." The shopkeeper nodded, gathered the medicine, and handed it over without a word. Back at the estate, Elias did not leave her side. He wiped her brow, whispered her name, fed her broth drop by drop. When she stirred, blinking as if surfacing from a long sleep, Elias exhaled like a man released from drowning. "Welcome back," he said, eyes glistening. She said nothing, only looked at him for a long time, as if seeing something that had not been there before. And days later, when Catherine walked through town for the first time since her illness, no one called her Mrs. Monroe. They called her what she truly was: Elias's wife. And they said it with something rare on the prairie: respect. The market was alive with the usual Saturday commotion: clatter, color, the smell of fresh apples and horses. Barrels thumped as they were unloaded, voices shouted over each other in greeting and bartering, and the air was thick with late autumn dust. But beneath the routine bustle, something simmered. "They say she's leaving him everything," one man murmured near the blacksmith's stall, his tone laced with suspicion. "Whole estate," another added, pulling a handkerchief across his sweaty brow. "Land, cattle, even the house. What's he ever done to earn that, besides look pretty and show up 20 years younger?" "He's a clever one," a third man chimed in. "Married into gold, that's all, just like a fox digging under the henhouse." Elias stood 10 feet away, by the feed sacks, his hands steady, but his jaw set hard. He had heard every word, each syllable striking like grit against glass. He turned slowly and stepped forward, out from the shadow of the stable awning and into the center of the square, where the morning sun was sharp and honest. "I didn't marry her for land," Elias said. The words dropped into the noise like a stone into still water. Voices fell away. A woman paused mid-haggle. A boy stopped mid-bite into a candied apple. All eyes turned. "I didn't marry her for land, or for comfort," he repeated, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I was born to a man who gambled away every acre we had, and a mother who begged so we could keep our name. I've known hunger. I've worked fields until my hands bled. I've sold my boots for beans. So, do not stand here and tell me I don't know the value of things." A breeze stirred the edge of his coat. The only sound was the distant creak of a hanging sign swaying above the general store. "She didn't buy me," Elias continued. "She gave me what no one else ever thought I deserved: the right to speak and be heard, the right to stand beside her, not behind, not below, and the right to dream, without shame." A few faces lowered. One man scratched at his neck. Another shifted uneasily on his heels. "She gave me respect," Elias said. "In this town, that's rarer than gold." He stood still, his words like iron posts in the wind, not shouted, just placed. Then, through the market crowd, came a quiet rustle, a sound not of gossip but of grace. "Catherine." She walked toward him with unhurried steps, dressed in a simple gray coat, hair pinned neat, face unreadable. The hush deepened as she reached Elias and paused beside him. Then she took his hand, both of her hands enfolding his, and looked up at him with something raw and rare in her eyes. "Elias," she said, voice low and unwavering, "thank you." The crowd did not stir, they did not cheer. But something inside them shifted, like soil after a long drought. And days later, when the town was quieter, Catherine visited the little art store near the mill. Behind glass, among forgotten frames, she found a charcoal sketch, faded and awkward. A boy on horseback, lines smudged but full of motion. Elias's first drawing, traded long ago for a bag of nails. She bought it without a word, had it cleaned and framed. Then she hung it above the fireplace, in the center of their home. No portraits, no oil paintings. Just that first, fragile dream. And beneath it, a brass plate read, "His hands built more than fences, they built belief." The wind carried the first scent of spring, damp soil, budding flowers, and wood smoke drifting faintly from distant chimneys. It was Catherine's birthday. She had not celebrated it in over a decade. Not since the year everything broke. That morning, she found Elias waiting at the kitchen table, boots muddy, hair tousled, a strange glimmer in his eyes. "Come with me," he said, holding out a hand. She followed him through the fields, past the old paddock, toward the back of the estate. There stood the structure no one used anymore, the abandoned woodshed, crooked and weather-worn. She hadn't stepped inside in years. But the door had been repaired, the hinges no longer creaked, and when he opened it, sunlight spilled into something entirely new. The walls had been sanded and whitewashed. The old beams gleamed with fresh polish. Shelves lined the walls, already half filled with books, poetry, art, history, philosophy. A small cast-iron stove flickered in one corner. On a wide wooden table sat pencils, brushes, jars of color, neatly stacked paper. Catherine stepped inside, stunned into silence. "It's yours," Elias said softly. "Your space, to read, to think, to just be." She turned to him, voice catching. "Why?" He looked at the floor for a moment before answering. "Because you gave me room to be more than what this world decided I could be. You gave me silence when I needed it, and presence when I did not ask. That room upstairs was never meant to be mine, but this feels like something we built." She walked to one of the bookshelves and ran her fingers along the spines. Then she stopped. There, tucked between 2 volumes of Emerson and Whitman, was a small sketchbook. She opened it. Inside were Elias's drawings, children playing near the creek, a dog asleep by the fire, faces half-finished, full of life. On the last page was a note, written in his rough script. "One day I thought I might teach them to draw, but life asked me to give up dreaming for surviving." Catherine closed the book gently, then turned to him with tears bright in her eyes. "You will teach them," she said. "We will make it happen." And just like that, it was decided. That afternoon, she called in a favor from the mayor's office. She drafted letters to families around the county. She arranged to have easels delivered from Austin, supplies from Dallas. She paid for every child to have their own set of pencils and paper. A week later, the first children came, muddy shoes, gap-toothed grins, eyes wide with wonder. And Elias knelt down to greet them not as a benefactor, but as someone who knew what it was to be small and unseen. That night, after the last child had gone home, after the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the air smelled faintly of spring grass and turpentine, Catherine stood by the window of the new studio, watching Elias clean the brushes. "You're good with them," she said. "I used to wish someone would be good with me." She stepped closer. "You never asked me for anything. I didn't think I had the right." Catherine reached for his hand. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. When their fingers met, it was not tentative. It was not for appearance or agreement. It was choice. Later, in the quiet of the house, no words were spoken. Only soft steps across wood floors. Only the hush of fabric falling and the slow intertwining of limbs long held apart by fear. And in that silence, finally, there was no debt, no contract. Only a woman and a man, choosing, at last, to call the same place home. The sun rose over the fields like a quiet promise. Morning dew clung to the grass, and laughter echoed faintly from the side barn, where children gathered with chalk-stained hands and smudges of paint on their cheeks. The old woodshed had become something more, a beacon. It had been 1 year. 1 year since Catherine's birthday. 1 year since Elias had turned an idea into a place where children with nothing were told they could be something. They had named it Dreamer's Rest. The name now hung above the ranch gate, carved into a thick slab of cedar, letters deep and proud. "Where everyone is allowed to dream," it read beneath, in smaller words. The town had changed, little by little. Curiosity became respect. Whispers became nods. Some who once mocked now sent their own children there, even if only to borrow a pencil and sit quietly in the presence of belief. One morning, Catherine opened the post and found a letter. The envelope was small, addressed with clumsy handwriting. She opened it at the breakfast table. Elias looked up as she read. Inside was a short note, written in violet ink. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, I did not know what a dream was until I came to your house. I thought dreams were only for rich people, or people with fathers, but now I draw the sky with wings. I want to be a bird doctor. Thank you for letting me dream. Elsie, age 8. Catherine folded the letter slowly. Her hands trembled. She has no family, Elias said quietly, but she found something here. That night, the ranch hosted its first anniversary celebration. Families came with pies and stories. Music played from a fiddle near the porch. The children put on a small art show, stick figure horses, messy sunsets, and flowers that reached the edge of the paper. Near the end, Elias stood by the lantern light, holding a glass of lemonade and the attention of the whole yard. He spoke plainly, as he always did. I married Catherine Monroe because my family was drowning in debt. That was the truth. A few heads turned. But what no one expected, he continued, was that the woman I married would give me more than a second chance. She gave me freedom. She gave me respect. She gave me back the right to believe I could be something more. He looked at Catherine then, her dress simple, her smile full. She gave me more than land or a name. She gave me a life, one I never dared to dream. Catherine stepped forward and took his hand in front of everyone. She leaned in and whispered, "You gave it back to me too." As lanterns flickered against the dusk and fireflies blinked like distant stars, children ran across the field chasing each other through dreams. And above them, carved in wood and lit by moonlight, the words stood strong. Dreamers Rest. A place built not on wealth, but on the belief that no one is too broken, too old, or too poor to begin again. If this story of healing, courage, and unexpected love moved you, don't forget to hit that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of hearts mended on dusty trails. Every share helps keep these stories alive, and reminds us all that sometimes the most powerful kind of love is the one we never saw coming.